Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Kenyans protesting against the police killing of an unarmed black man in the US also speak out against the number of Africans who've died during security forces' heavy-handed enforcement of coronavirus curfews. Also, seek and you shall find. DR Congolese pastors go door to door to keep worshippers' faith topped up, even as they pray for churches shut as part of the coronavirus fight back to reopen. And in South Africa, the pandemic's hit the incomes of rural workers who ordinarily rely on the tourism industry. Some game farmers have been donating the meat of culled animals to struggling communities. We take a closer look. But first, global protests against police brutality that cost the life of George Floyd in the US have spread to Africa. The 46-year-old unarmed black man was killed in Minneapolis on May 25th. On Tuesday, crowds of demonstrators gathered outside of the US Embassy in Nairobi, calling for an end to the frequency with which black Americans die at the hands of police.
What is important is to understand that there is a clear linkage between white supremacism and the problems, particularly police brutality and dictatorships that are going on across Africa. Many of the dictators that make our lives brutal and unlivable are funded by US taxpayer money. We are here to express that solidarity with the American people, but to also say that white supremacy is a cancer that is also affecting us.
I believe that when you are silent, you are part of the oppressor. And I am a privileged white woman from the US, and it is my responsibility to be speaking up against what is happening right now to black people around the world, but especially in the country I come from.
Actually, we have American friends who live here. We want them to be accountable, especially our white Americans in Kenya. They need to be accountable. They need to be in solidarity with what's happening in the world. They can't keep quiet, because if you're white and in Kenya, you're privileged already. You don't find poor white people in Kenya, you know? And so because of that, they need to be their voice, and they need to champion, and they need to change. From here is a chain reaction to the West.
The outrage also echoes with local frustration over the number of Kenyans who have lost their lives as police have heavy-handedly enforced the country's coronavirus curfew. At least 21 have been killed since March 27th. Nanjala Nyabola brings us more from Nairobi.
The subject of police brutality is obviously at the forefront of a lot of people's minds around the world, with the distribution of the video of the assassination of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis. Here in Kenya, that particular video has actually brought up a lot of issues that we are having to struggle with as a society, which is how to reform our police and how to basically deal with the scourge of extrajudicial executions. Extrajudicial executions are a huge problem in Kenya. Just today, the Independent Medical Legal Unit, which is a nonprofit that specializes in documenting and providing independent coroner services, but also in documenting extrajudicial executions, they issued a report that found that since January, security services in Kenya have killed 77 people. And since the beginning of a curfew that was put in place to deal with the COVID-19 outbreak, that security services have killed 15 people in different parts of the country. And in fact, just yesterday, there was another extrajudicial execution because a homeless man in the informal settlement of Mathare was killed by the police because he was found to be outside after curfew. And of course, that's a bit of a tautology. Of course, he was outside because he's homeless. And that led to protests in Mathare. But because of the restrictions on freedom of movement right now that are in place because of the COVID-19 outbreak, I think it's been very difficult to get an offline mobilization going. And protest is actually a very bureaucratic process in Kenya. You have to get all kinds of permits in order to protect yourself from being tear gassed, being another victim of extrajudicial execution, another victim of police violence. So we are kind of in the space where the George Floyd murder has allowed people to articulate a discourse against police brutality that unites countries as disparate as Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, South Africa, Kenya, countries that have a long history of police violence, and being able to frame that as part and parcel of, that it's inherent in the way that we do policing, because the initial logic of why we started the police services in different parts of the world was to protect the property of the rich from the poor. And incidentally, in a lot of colonial contexts, the rich were white colonial families. And so this is the kind of framework that I think people are starting to interrogate more publicly in countries like Kenya. And to see that the mobilization in the US is kind of making people think critically about what they're doing in their own society to deal with something that is a problem, and to see who's already working on this issue and perhaps start thinking about how they can also contribute to the discourse.
Nanjala Nyabula there for us in Nairobi. Well, Uganda's pushed back the reopening of schools for final year students to another month. The government said that there was a shortage of coronavirus testing kits needed to screen pupils every 2 weeks, and therefore the need for the delay. The country's brought in some of the strictest measures to curb the spread of COVID-19 on the continent. A dusk to dawn curfew in place is due to remain in place for another 3 weeks. The country's logged at least 457 coronavirus cases and no deaths. Meanwhile, Zimbabwe has ramped up security in Harare and turned away thousands of motorists in response to a spike in new coronavirus cases. Only essential workers were allowed into the capital's centre on Tuesday. Cases have more than doubled over the past week to hit 203. 4 deaths have been recorded. The country has also confirmed its first cases in prisons, with 4 inmates and 2 guards testing positive. Most of the other new infections are reportedly citizens who've returned from foreign travel. A lockdown had been brought in on March 30th, but measures were relaxed last month. Religious communities across the continent haven't been able to come together for services as houses of worship remain shut as part of the coronavirus fight back. In DR Congo, some churches are literally going the extra mile to get to their scattered congregations. Our correspondents report.
Worshippers in Goma are not allowed to go to church, so the church comes to them. Places of worship have been closed in DR Congo since March, but that hasn't stopped Pastor Jean-Daniel. Bible and microphone in hand, he tours around his neighbourhood every Sunday to greet the faithful.
Since they closed the churches, we've been sad. It's been very difficult for us. I'm so glad to see the pastor come to comfort us. We miss going to church so much.
Churches have been deprived of donations, but the pastor is most worried about not being able to preach his beliefs at a time of crisis.
Les âmes doivent être ramenées à Christ. C'est ça le manque à gagner. Donc, comme les églises sont fermées, on ne prêche pas partout, mais nous nous confions à Dieu, nous prions pour que les gens puissent avoir un esprit de réveil.
At the other end of the country, Father Jean-Marie has also seen his daily life turned upside down by the pandemic. He now celebrates Mass alone in his little church. To maintain the link with his parish, he shares his speeches and prayers on WhatsApp and Facebook.
L'Église doit utiliser tous les moyens à sa disponibilité pour propager l'Évangile. Les prêtres qui sont aussi dans les réseaux sociaux, qui sait utiliser les réseaux sociaux, il ouvre un chemin de plus sur le plan pastoral.
For many worshippers, not being able to gather for prayers has been a major struggle. To help those who feel isolated, Catholic radio service Radio Maria airs a new daily show that lets listeners call in and share their experiences.
Maman, en tout cas, maman, je ne cesserai de le dire, je t'aime.
Les auditeurs cherchent un peu de réconfort, cherchent une parole qui peut les toucher en cette pandémie pour qu'ils vivent l'espérance. Alors cette parole, nous leur adressons à travers les messes, à travers les émissions.
Across the DRC, there have been growing calls to reopen places of worship, particularly in areas not yet affected by the pandemic.
Rural communities in South Africa have been finding it tough to get supplies under the country's coronavirus slowdown. There's been less work, less movement and fewer deliveries. That's led to a rise in the need for food donations. Well, some game farmers have been giving away game to people in townships who've been struggling to get by. Take a look.
Culling. It happens every year on this game farm to keep antelope numbers under control. But during the coronavirus outbreak, unlike other years, none of this meat is sold for profit. It all goes to struggling families who live nearby. These Samaritans want to stay anonymous to avoid problems with the local authorities. The fear is that going through the proper channels would result in delays, political grandstanding, or possible corruption. The game farmers in the north of the country donate the meat, which a local shop owner repackages at his own cost.
We don't want any interference. We've been doing it for 20 years. We've stepped it up by doing meat at the moment. We want to keep it sustainable. And we want to make sure that the food gets to where it's most needed.
A local charity distributes the food to a nearby settlement. Many people are unemployed and those with casual jobs cannot work because of the COVID-19 restrictions.
Lockdown has really given us a negative impact in terms of poverty. Most people now, they are really suffering.
Each package contains some game meat and vegetables. It provides much-needed help for this mother and her son, who live on a government grant of just over $20 per month.
This food parcel is very important for us to survive, because we wouldn't have been able to without getting at least a bit of meat.
As the lockdown drags on, the benefactors will keep going for as long as they can. To date, the program feeds around 200 families, but every day the call for help continues to rise.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.